Hello and welcome back to Online Education Across the Atlantic. After a little bit of a hiatus after our Leeds conference, while Morgan and I did some LMS VLE users conferences. But as we head into the end of season 2, we really wanted to wrap back and talk about what we've actually learned in this market and where things are pointing. And obviously, there's going to be a healthy dosage of AI conversation within this context as well. So it's great seeing you two again. And Neil, go ahead and take us through this conversation.
Yeah, no, it's good to be back and good to see you guys. So yeah, you guys have been busy, haven't you? Because you traveled over to Leeds, which was the last time we recorded a podcast. And then was it prior to that or after that you were at the conferences? I forget now.
Well, it was sort of a mix. I did the Open edX conference right before Leeds, but then the other ones were all after actually just a few days after we got back.
Yep. So you've been traveling across the US. Morgan managed to avoid Las Vegas. Is that right?
That is absolutely right. Yes.
So, excellent.
A win, I would say.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, I think what we thought this episode is that we'd focus in on the three VLE and LMS companies who had conferences recently. So Anthology and Blackboard, Instructure and Canvas, D2L and Brightspace. And I'd kind of grill you guys on some of the things that were uncovered there, some of the conversations you might have had. So maybe if we start off with Anthology, because we had a podcast recording a couple of episodes back, didn't we, where we were talking about maybe some of the expectations around that side of things and for the different companies. So I think one of the things that we probably collectively focused on in terms of Anthology was the kind of current status of the company. And so I guess just interested to know, what you found out about the current status of Anthology in terms of issues that they have around debt restructuring, what your expectations are, what the buzz was around that in the conference, whether it was kind of spoken about much. Phil, I think you were at the Anthology Together conference,
yes,
right?
I'm the one who got to go to Las Vegas and got to spend, $9 per bottle of water. By the way, just an interesting Vegas note, all kinds of stories are coming out lately about how the tourism industry is going way down in Vegas. Part of it's because of the Canadians not wanting to come to the U.S., but another part of it is they're just pricing themselves out of the market. I mean, it's just the prices for dinner on the Strip are just getting stupid. So it was a little bit of if you want to start off with a vibe, a little bit not too encouraging for the city, but that might mean there are fewer conferences there. But so going into Anthology, I mean, I think that our discussion ahead of the event really captured the issues quite well. I mean, in one sense, nothing really changed at the conference from what we said ahead of time, other than we weren't sure if they were going to address the company's debt situation at all. And there was a clear answer that publicly they did not. So basically at the conference, in the keynotes, they didn't address the fact that right now they're facing a debt restructuring or bankruptcy and are seeking to sell off Blackboard, although that looks less and less likely over time that that's going to happen, which means that bankruptcy, a restructuring, keeping the company alive, is more likely. And none of this was actually addressed at the conference. So it was sort of strange that they just didn't even try to head it off at all. And there was a piece of me saying, well, I wonder if it's just analysts who care about this and that the regular colleges and universities don't really care. But that's not really true, because during all the lunch conversations, the hallway conversations, the private interviews, you heard a very different story, that, most of the meetings that the executives are having, they're having to answer questions about the company's financial status right up front. And so it's there. Colleges and universities do care about it. They're asking about it. Yet it was sort of interesting from a messaging perspective. They avoided it, but I have to say it wasn't as if people in the sessions were saying, hey, what's going on? Why aren't, what's going to happen? Are you going to still be in business, or whatever the case may be? So they took a bet to avoid the topic publicly, even though they acknowledge it's happening all the time. And, from a conference perspective, that certainly worked out for them. So, I mean, there's obviously more to cover, but that was the biggest surprise that I saw.
Yeah.
So at D2L, they changed the format for analysts. And I realize that's a very small and select group. But, sometimes as an analyst, you meet with people one-on-one, or sometimes you meet with other analysts. But here they had a full-on meeting of all the analysts. So there were the people that cover the product like me, and Justin Menard from Listed Tech, and they had all the financial analysts as well, all in one meeting. And that was fascinating. And we really enjoyed that. But I suspect that was not what they did at Anthology. That would have provided some fireworks, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, acknowledging the fact that D2L is publicly traded, so I think that changes that, and the way their tone as a company, I think, is also different. That they might do that at Anthology. It was very open with the product, what you're calling the product analyst, or myself, IDC, Gartner, Justin as well with Listed Tech. They acknowledged the debt situation in the analyst meeting, which is a private meeting. So they acknowledged that, and we had a short conversation about it. Nobody else is writing about it, or at least publicly writing about it, which I don't see how you can cover them as a company and not mention this. But we didn't have that mix the way you're talking about. So that it was this weird thing, very open, but not on the main stage and not with the main messaging.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I feel like it makes sense to not say anything from the front, because in one sense, it's kind of inconclusive, isn't it? I mean, it's an issue that they can only say so much about, but can't really offer anything conclusive in terms of what's going to happen next. So that kind of makes sense to me. But it's interesting to me that it was a topic of conversation outside of the sessions, because I think, again, this was maybe something that we brought up last time. I'm always interested the extent to which this kind of news filters through, because we haven't had I mean, you're talking about the reporting in the US around this kind of stuff and the lack of it. We haven't had really anything here. So I'm not sure how kind of widely spread that news is, and the potential anxiety and considerations it might bring about in terms of institutions thinking about that side of things over here. I'm really not sure about that. But
well, I think the vendors, actually, I know this, that their competitors, Instructure and Ellucian in particular, they're actively bringing this up during competitive bids. They're telling potential customers, pay attention to the debt situation. We don't know what's going to happen. So maybe if you're a university who's not in an evaluation, you might not be seeing the news, but at least when they're being evaluated, I know it's getting brought up by other people. And just one final note, then we could maybe get on to the other stuff about them as well. I mean, I guess the reason I bring it up, if I were them, I know the most consistent issue they have to deal with is that higher education's unsophisticated in financial analysis. So when they hear bankruptcy, there are a lot of people saying, oh, you're going to go out of business. Blackboard might cease to exist. And the answer is no. This is Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This is restructuring debt while you continue to operate. And the company's already done most of the cost cutting that it can do, or a lot of the cost cutting. So they have to get out there saying, no, this is not even an option about no company. So if I were them, but I guess I'm not them, if I were them, I would have made that my message. We're going nowhere. We might have to deal with debt, but it's in the background and we can make this work. But it was just interesting to see how they chose to approach it. And I have to admit, I think that it worked. And most of the focus really was on the product changes, and broad-based, not just Blackboard. But yeah, they they successfully focused on the product and what they're doing.
Yeah, because that makes sense to me in that, some of the analysis you've done doesn't point to this necessarily being a product that's suddenly going to disappear. But I guess the concern would probably be allied to the fact that are you going to have a consistent strategy because of the product's been developing and in particular ways, and we talked about before how they have really kind of gone all in on AI in a way that others haven't. And I think one of my questions and my concerns relative to what happens in the future is that's been a direction that we've noticed over the past couple of years. If there was a substantive change, a sale, like what would that do for that strategy? But anyway, that's kind of by the by. On that point, though, I'm just interested, did the conference announcements in terms of how the product developed kind of just further reinforce what they've been doing around AI? They kind of very much, I think one of their messages is, we were the first to have AI natively in our LMS, but I just be interesting to pick out some of the kind of key product announcements around AI and what you thought of those.
Yeah, the short answer is they're doubling down on their AI strategy. And at least right now, there's no indication of change on that strategy at all, and they're making it work. You raise a good question about if there happens to be a sale, would that change things? But we don't know. At the conference and what they're demonstrating, they keep going the same direction. The biggest difference I've noticed is this year, you're not just seeing AI-based product enhancements and seeing numbers such as the number of schools adopting Course Builder or whatever. This is the first conference where I think you could just roam the halls, talk to people at lunch, and hear from customers directly saying, oh, we're fully using this AI feature, and this is the one we like, and here's how we adopt it. So it's really moved into actual adoption by a lot of customers, where the biggest information I got was from them. Up on stage and what they announced, very important. But even more important for me was the fact that you could talk to customers who are using stuff that was announced a year ago. And one of the ones that I heard the most about was the rubric builder. So basically, once you're designing a course and you want to create a rubric for assessment, being able to actually get AI to generate that rubric, and then you can fine tune it and actually use it. And I've heard from a couple of schools who said that is the biggest time saver. They like the course builder. They like some of the other things. They like the data. But like there's individual tools like that where customers are really saying they're saving time, and they're saying this is changing our view of what Blackboard does for the better. So same strategy, but we're moving into the real usage cases you can talk to customers about. Now, as far as product announcements, one of the big parts that they did was this Ava, the Anthology virtual assistant, which is really getting into, chatbot support, tutoring, however you want to frame it. So not just use AI to do this function. Once you're in the rubric building, click the button and have it work. This is getting more into a conversational approach. And so they certainly announced that. And, there are other things that were out there, but similar strategy, but they just keep moving along. But before I'll sort of turn it over and get additional thoughts, because I know you guys have, read the analysis, but seen their press releases. Blackboard Anthology, and specifically Nico Mathis, has got the best presentation of AI that I've seen. They actually don't just say we're doing this. They give time frames. They give the context of when things are going to be available if they're not available today. So it's just a very mature product management approach that lends a lot of credibility to what they're doing. And so these two topics combined are why I framed it in my post about if only they had a time machine. Go make these product improvements and changes, but if they could have done it years ago when they weren't having to deal with a debt restructure, I think we'd have a different story right now if that were true. So that was my what I
I think
saw.
there's an odd tension. Their product announcements are great. I wish everybody would just do it just like Nico does. It's clear, the dates are clear, everything else. Blackboard back in the day had a communication problem. They
Yes.
told people what they wanted to hear, not what was actually the truth or what was really happening. And there seems a contrast there. When it comes to product, they're being very clear, everything like that. But when it comes to the debt, they're going back to their old habits of not telling people things.
Well, they're not telling, but at least they're not telling people wrong things.
So yeah, there
Give
has
them
been
credit for that, I guess. But it is an interesting observation.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a reflection on, the different levels of confidence. Maybe to do not to kind of be positive about them. Maybe they are very clear and confident in their roadmap for the product, such that they can be more clear and less less driven by what they think people want to hear. I mean, I thought it was interesting with the virtual assistant. I thought some of the features were interesting. I felt the feedback assistant, where it kind of generates feedback from rubrics, and you can basically take your unformed notes and ideas around feedback on stuff, and it can kind of polish those up with kind of interesting advancement, I suppose, in terms of what they're doing. But there's also kind of a couple of interesting things on Ava for me so the automation one was really interesting around the kind of, so this is personalized nudges and messages to students that are based on that kind of rules-based side of things. And I thought that was interesting because that didn't strike me as a particularly advanced feature, but it was wrapped within a set of features that were more advanced. It struck me as something that might have been able to be implemented actually a number of years ago, way before actually ChatGPT and everything kind of launched on the scene. So that was interesting for me. And correct me if I'm wrong, that felt like that was the only one that was clearly kind of just going to be part of Blackboard going forward. I think the others had like a timescale in terms of when they might be available for. And I think I don't know whether that's accurate, Phil, or not, but that's what I.
Well, I think there's a lot of things they have available today that they've said are free or included in your bundle. There are a couple things, like I believe the video, this gets outside of AI, the video thing that they announced and how that's getting adopted, where they've said, okay, it's free for another year, but it's not clear what the future bundled pricing is going to be. So it's sort of a mix. I think you have both cases that you're seeing from them.
Yeah, because I in my mind, where my thinking goes around what you were saying around adoption and also the way that they're developing things and that kind of pricing thing, is I feel like they have been very deliberate in offering a lot of things for free, and I think that ties in with the adoption point as well. And we could juxtapose that with maybe the D2L approach for kind of add-ons and stuff. But I guess
that might be a good segue into that. But I will point out that one thing, last year it felt like they're throwing everything in, and desperate might be a little bit pejorative, but they're throwing things in and trying to see what sticks and see if that helps with adoption. This year, they certainly have kept with the, hey, you're not going to have to pay for this, at least for another year type of mentality. But it felt more organized to me. It didn't feel as, let's throw it against the wall and see what sticks, see what helps out. So it's, they're going definitely with the include this to goose adoption in a meaningful way. That's their bet. I don't see any signs they're going to change that pending the debt restructuring and next year. I mean, a couple of these new features, they've said that it's included until July 2026. So I think we'll learn a lot next year. But right now it seems consistent to me.
Yeah. It still felt to me like, and this is more of a cross-cutting point, but this still felt to me a lot of the features and the product developments are focused on instructors still, but there was something in Ava that interests me, which is this kind of, is it Ava Playground, where it's like,
Yeah.
I wasn't clear on what that was. It said that it gave students access to a bunch of generative AI models. I wasn't sure whether those are kind of, I don't know what they meant by that. I don't know if you got any clarity on that and what they were aiming for.
It's an access play. What happens if you have, students who don't have money or their school is not ponying up for the different AI things? Here's a way you can provision it and let people play around with it, and you're not dealing with a digital divide. That's sort of the general message. The second thing is sort of a safe area to play around, encourage people to play around and learn what AI is. I don't want to be negative. I didn't have much interest in that. I didn't have much interest when Instructure announced the same thing, but so it may sound like I'm also instructor centric. That one didn't feel that very well thought out. I didn't hear reactions of, oh, thank goodness, that's what we just wanted. So that was one of the least interesting features that I heard about.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm being slightly controversial, I do feel like Anthology are the strongest when it comes to virtue signaling around AI, transparency and ethics and that side of things in terms of their messaging. And I think it interested me looking at the Playground thing, because he said all activities logged for transparency was the word, but instructors can see how students are using AI. And it's an interesting juxtaposition between this idea of transparency and giving students a tool and equitable access, but actually the instructor is able to see what's happening as well, which is, I thought was potentially threw up an ethical dilemma that wasn't sort of necessarily addressed, but maybe that's just an aside. I don't know. It was just interesting in that sense. Were there any other themes coming out? I mean, I guess, we're focused on the LMS VLE products, but these companies also have other products. And I'm just interested in whether there was a strong emphasis on any other products. What you took out of
their
that?
messaging is centered around student information system, CRM, and LMS. Those are the three pillars of what they do. The SIS, it's the parent company's main product, if you will, but there's not much there that really ties into what we talk about on the educational side. The CRM's a little bit different. So they definitely are playing up Reach, which is their CRM, and pointing out, hey, if you have a faculty member who wants to easily nudge students because they've said these students are turning things in late or are at risk and I'm going to nudge them, that nudge, that type of communication, they're now tying it into the CRM. So what that means is advisors, student support people will be able to see what faculty have been interacting, and they can take it and that can inform them as they're supporting students outside of the classroom. So there was a CRM tie-in, but there's not a whole lot of overlap of people using their LMS and CRM. So it was like a nice job, but I don't think there are that many people. It's not going to really move the needle except for that subset of schools that really do that. So there was non-LMS news, but I didn't pay too much attention to it, to be quite honest, other than how it informed what's happening in the classroom and the LMS side.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I the one thing I picked up from your post, Phil, was that Learn Original has a date for its demise, shall we say?
Yeah, the end of next year. So a year and a half from Original goes away, which is good. I think they should have done that before, because it allows them to focus on here's our LMS and here's what it does, and let's just look forward. So I thought that was really good. But that is a huge milestone that they announced it. And there wasn't a big outcry against it that you might think. That sort of backs up my point. They should have done this a while ago.
A long time ago.
Yeah. Definitely should have done that a long time ago. So it was newsworthy, but at the same time, it didn't generate much interest, and that's good news for them.
Yeah, I was thinking to myself, I don't know how to commemorate that. that day. Not sure whether to wistfully look back on my use of that in universities or to celebrate or what, but it was I don't know. It had a reaction, had some kind of reaction. I don't know whether it was fondness or happiness. I guess we'll maybe at the end we'll kind of talk a bit about this, but I just wondered what your kind of top line impressions and around like the health of the company. I know we talked about the debt, but just generally the vibe coming out of that conference and the future trajectory.
Well, it all depends on this debt restructuring. The company as is and the way it's being managed, it's outside of their SIS and some of the service problems, which I think they're dealing with. I think that in general, the company feels healthier and healthier. And if it weren't for the debt, I would be saying, hey, I think that it's going to become a 3-horse race again. Them joining Canvas and D2L with new adoptions. If it weren't for that. So it will get resolved this fall. So this fall, we'll find out. It's going to make that news really interesting, but otherwise, top line reaction was very positive for them.
Yep. Well, perhaps we might move on to one of their competitors, D2L, because I think, Morgan, you went to the D2L Fusion Conference in Georgia, am I right?
Yes, in Savannah, which was boiling hot.
Even hotter than Leeds?
Yes.
Okay.
It was it was sweltery and hot, but it was a lovely hotel, except I arrived in the middle of the night and I wasn't sort of sure where it was, and I went to bed and I woke up to this enormous noise, and I rushed and looked out the window, and there was a giant container ship going right past my window, really close.
Are those as loud as freight trains?
They were pretty loud, yeah. And you don't really expect to see a container ship outside your window, like really close. So that made for some excitement. But yeah, it was in Savannah, a very sweltery Savannah, and most of us ended up having to catch a ferry across the river to get to the convention center, which made for a journey every morning.
But we're going back, like I think a lot of us dislike the Vegas, the Orlando type things. Did you get a good, hey, but I'm in a nice medium to smaller size city with some great local food? Did you get the benefits of it though?
It was too hot. And maybe, maybe I'm just getting a wussy in my old age, but, I certainly had a couple of nice meals, but yeah, it was mostly just too difficult to get around. It was like swimming, and it smelled bad because it was hot. And so,
well, you have to go back when it's not as hot and humid there, because
yes,
that is
Savannah
a really
has
nice
changed.
city.
I haven't been there in 10 years, and it's changed a lot. It's much more built up and so on. So, but yeah, no, it was in general, it was a nice venue, and certainly I much prefer it to Vegas. I'd go to Savannah on the hottest week of the year rather than Vegas.
I feel like the TripAdvisor component of the conference isn't faring so well. We got expensive meals in Vegas, too hot for good food in Savannah.
Yeah. Justin was trying to persuade me to start a regular feature on the blog about conference food. So
I think there'd be people who follow that.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'll start with Moodle.
Yeah.
Very good, very good. Because am I right? You hadn't been to D2L Fusion for a little while, but I just wondered, like, I think in your post you were talking about maybe the contrast from when you were last there to now. Just interested to,
I hadn't been since 2019, I think. So because of either pandemic or being at Gartner or it falling on the same week and Phil and I having to split it up. So I hadn't been in a while, but it felt like a very different sort of place, much more hopeful, much more confident. And I made a joke about the container ships were bringing the updates, and it felt like that. There was a lot announced, in terms of new features around AI, with the LearnWise partnership as well as other kinds of things. So it was a very confident kind of place, and a lot of sort of forward-looking things.
Because I'm interested in the LearnWise relationship, because they made a lot of feature announcements for Lumi, and it wasn't immediately clear to me which one of those equated to the LearnWise relationship, or whether all of them equated to that LearnWise relationship.
Only some of them, and like me, you're confused about it. So in general, their messaging has become very clear, but like I had a real problem where the names given were different depending on whether you went to the LearnWise booth in the convention center, or from the main stage, or from the page that they put up. So it was confusing in terms of what things were. That would be one sort of criticism there.
Because I feel like that's a bit of a theme in general. I was thinking about this earlier today in terms of, a bit of a timeline of AI features in LMS, and I feel like I think this is understandable to an extent because it's kind of a new thing, but certain things get layered upon as established things, certain things get incorporated into other things, certain things kind of go away and get rebadged as something. I think the Lumi one is interesting because you've got I'm trying to keep up with how many you've got. Lumi Chat and Lumi Study Spot and Lumi this, and then you've got a Creator Plus and Accessibility Plus now. And I get that we're in that phase of AI product development, but I think that is an interesting dimension of it, the kind of level of confusion around the features and how they're labeled and how they're packaged together. And Lumi, I don't know how many features Lumi has now. I can't keep up.
I don't know off the top of my head, but there's quite a few. But I think, I mean, they've got an interesting tension here, and maybe it is a question of where they are in this progression. But everything has a different name, and I wonder if it wouldn't be just to call it Lumi, and there are these features, and features come and go, so that it's less of a lift.
Well, one thing I would add in is there's sort of a different approach, it sounds like, because Blackboard Anthology, they have various features, but they haven't really tried to tie it in to one brand. And like Ava is Ava. But D2L also has multiple different features, but then they've attempted to wrap their arms around it with the Lumi brand. But then there's a confusion about, well, what do you mean? And so it's a very different approach between the two.
Yeah. And I'm not sure it's the right one at D2L at the moment. I think it'll start to get confusing, especially as some things aren't going to work, so they're going to have to take it away. Or put other things in there, So I think it's for the same reason back in the day I used to encourage people to not call their LMS by the brand name, because when you swap it out, people get all upset.
What were the features that stood out for you, Morgan, at the conference?
So not necessarily just in Lumi, but the Accessibility Plus, I think, is a huge thing, and clients were very excited about that. So that sort of garnered a lot of things. There's the create space, which I think is an interesting thing. I'm sort of fascinated by it. I'm not sure it's going to work. I think it'll be a great feature for large enterprise centralized places that have to share content and things like that. So places like Southern New Hampshire, like Purdue Global, and those sorts of
so for more team-based content development?
Yeah, because you create in Create Space, and you can version down the road. You'll be able to version and share and push updates out and things like that. So it's a content management system, really. But they were describing it as the content management system for 2025 as opposed to the old ones. But, I just don't think we know enough about how faculty work and that sort of really personal kind of way that they create content. So I'm not sure that your average faculty member will want that or use it or share it. And I'm happy to be wrong, but I just don't think people typically work that way.
Yeah, I actually think you could almost make a similar argument to the H5P Creator Plus as well, and I think both of those things, both the Create Space and H5P, really appealed to me on the back of experience of working on online courses. I think it aligns more closely with that, and I think that's a point you made in your post, Morgan. So in that sense, that makes sense to me in terms of a strategic theme for them, but the extent to which your regular instructor, if such a thing exists, is using interactive tools and using kind of collaborative content development. I think, I'd love to have some data on that, but I'm just anecdotally, I'm not sure how common that is. But I think that kind of ties in with something I was going to ask, which kind of contrasts with what Phil was saying around Anthology. I got the impression when I was at the D2L event in Europe that I wasn't sure the extent to which people were adopting some of these AI features. And so I'm interested, Phil was saying Anthology have got that year behind them where people seem to be using a lot of their AI features and are reporting, broadly positively about that. Did you get that sense at the D2L conference or not?
No, because it's way early. I mean, this was a lot of them are much newer, I think. So I didn't get a lot of, and some of them aren't even there yet. So I think it'll be a next year catch up, or when you go to whatever salubrious place in Europe you're going this year for D2L, as opposed to sweltering Savannah.
Given the time of year, it'll definitely be colder.
Yes.
Definitely be colder.
What about the reaction to it? Because even if there's not adoption, there's sort of a question of, are they hitting the mark? Right?
There's a weird sense, and I thought about this, and I didn't write about it, but I thought about it, and I was going to for a while, but there's this odd, I hesitate to use the word disjuncture because maybe I've overused it, but companies roll out these big features that they've put a lot of thought into, a lot of effort and things like that. And to an extent, there's a very muted response. And certainly at D2L, there was a muted response to the AI thing, and to some of the other sorts of things like, create space, less with accessibility plus. And then it's the tiny, as one D2L person put it, the ankle biters that get all the excitement. It was print quiz that got everybody cheering and dancing in the hallways. And it must be a bit depressing if you're in a company. You've sort of thrown a lot of stuff into this, but it was a muted response because I think nobody sort of really. In part because it was confusing in a way, like what exactly is it? How is it going to work? How am I going to roll it out? And things like that. Whereas Print Quiz, they know what that is and they've wanted it for a while.
Yeah, I did think what was notable on some of the Lumi announcements, though, were a couple of features for students. So they had a study support tool and they had a tutor tool. And, I think it wouldn't be right to say the others haven't developed stuff that students can't use, but I felt like there was a bit more of a flavor of a focus on learners. And actually, I think looking at some of their product pages, I think they do have a differentiation between stuff for instructors and maybe designers and students. So yeah. I think that was coming out a bit more, which is interesting. It'd be interesting to see, whether the impacts of that as well.
Also sort of a bigger picture, like you can bring other data into a lot of these things. So you can bring, help desk data and CRM data and things like that, rather than just a very confined space within the LMS. I wanted to go back to H5P. Do we have to say H5P because we have Neil here?
Yeah, you do. Yeah, It's in the contract.
Okay. But I was sort of impressed by how much progress they'd made, because they just announced it last year at the conference. And already there's a lot of different ways that H5P is built into things. Sorry, I can't say, okay. So it's in quizzes and those sort of things. And actually talking to clients at lunch and things like that, they were excited about those kinds of things. They were pretty stoked about the H5P. Some of them, they were just learning, but others were pretty excited.
Interesting.
It's interesting because, I mean, last year, since you and I swapped last year, you were in InstructureCon, I was at D2L. The H5P, which was a big announcement, it came out of the blue. A lot of the employees didn't even know about it. So really, they've only had a year to figure out this integration. So based on what you're saying, that's actually makes it even more impressive to me.
I think
it truly is in the past year.
Yeah. And actually, I will remember the H5P announcement forever because I was actually at the InstructureCon last year when I saw you texted me or something like that. And right at that moment, somebody on the stage in the session I was in said, "Yeah, well, we're using H5P." And I said, "D2L just bought them."
So you were doing your version of what we saw 20 years ago when we had the LMS conference in California and somebody runs in, Blackboard bought WebCT.
Yes, very loudly. Yes, I did that. I tried to be less loud and less obnoxious, but I probably failed. Sorry, presenter.
Were there any other things, like we've talked a bit about the continuing education side of things. Like, was there anything in that realm or anything kind of wider in terms of product or types of client focus that suggests, a particular trajectory and focus?
No, that was a source of frustration on my part. There was very little about continuing education and very little about Mastery Connect, which was sort of weird because I bumped into a lot of people who were actually either Blackboard clients or Canvas clients who were at D2L essentially to kick the tires from a continuing ed kind of perspective. So the fact that there was so little on in the main stages was perplexing. So that was weird. Where they talked about it was mostly in terms of corporate, which was a big focus for them. They're really growing that, they're really emphasizing it, and it's really less corporate. Though they, for example, have one of the speakers I did hear was a guy from Komatsu, but mostly it was associations. So it's sort of like that in between corporate and higher ed, but it was mostly in that sort of corporate space that they were talking about it, which I thought was a lost opportunity, just given that I kept bumping into people who were really interested in that space and weren't using the product now. It's obviously a space that's just dying for more activity and more attention. Everybody's sort of stumbling around on it.
Yeah, it felt to me, reading at your post across the conference, that in terms of kind of more macro themes for education, there was a bit more on competency-based side of things, which is kind of very embryonic over here, but still getting a bit more interest, but less on the kind of continuing education, non-accredited kind of course space. But coming away from the conference, obviously D2L and Instructure have been kind of two of the most successful companies for implementations in recent years and grown their share. Like, what were your impressions coming away from the conference in terms of their prospects for the next 12 months, say?
They were good. It's that confidence I spoke to. Their messaging is much better for the most part. They're obviously getting at some of the things that are really driving users, with the exception of the continuing education. But there certainly is growing interest and a growing confidence and a sense of, both vision and execution. I think so. They were touting some of their wins and win rate, and I think they're certainly a force to watch, especially as they seem to have a growing maturity about stuff. One of the leadership actually mentioned the phrase, we need to put on our big boy pants. It's that sort of, to make decisions which they may not have made in the past. For example, like the partnership with the AI company rather than
LearnWise.
building it. Building it inside.
Yeah. We should move on to Instructure, because I think I think what came across to me for Anthology and for D2L was interesting new announcements, but not necessarily a massive gear shift from what you'd been expecting. But I feel like the Instructure conference is the one, I suppose, in terms of over here, had like really eye-catching news in terms of the OpenAI partnership. But I think there was kind of some more substantial stuff there with IgniteAI. So interested to get your thoughts and take and explanation of that, Phil.
Yeah. Well, I'll start off, since we're doing the location news.
Yeah, tell us about the food.
Yeah. Well, it was more the whiskey. I mean, I found this place, Purgatory, that has 1,000 bottles of whiskey, like 1,000 different types of whiskey. And so I ended up going there afterwards. But yeah, the fact that I went there 5 times during a 2.5-day trip speaks to how good that place was. Good place to eat.
I just felt like I was in purgatory, or at least close to hell in terms of the heat.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Well, this, from a heat perspective, it was like Leeds. They're having a heat wave, so it's in the low 80s, the upper 20s centigrade, and people are apologizing. We're sorry, it's so hot here. And I'm like, what are you talking about? This is lovely weather. But you're right, Neil. It was the biggest new information changes were happening at Instructure more than Anthology and D2L. It was certainly compared to what the three of us have talked about in the past. I thought that in our podcast episode where we kept highlighting the lack of coherence, that trend continued through. There still is a lack of coherence. But they really came out with a much stronger, bolder bet into AI than you've seen in the past. In the past, I've made fun of them where it seems like most of their AI strategy is defined on what they're not going to do, what they're going to enable partners to do, for schools to do, other people to do AI. This was the time where AI was all over the main stage. And you mentioned the two big things. IgniteAI, their branded, their internal tool that includes now, or got announced, the Ignite Chat, which is the chatbot that they've added to it. And that's central to their strategy. And then the OpenAI announcement. But before we get to the Ignite stuff, the OpenAI, it felt a lot like the Conmigo for the past 2 Instructure cons. Hey, we've got enough clout. We've got a famous person up on stage. They got the head of product for OpenAI. He came out on stage. And the feeling was like, wow, Instructure, you've got enough pull that you've got OpenAI coming out and making a message about how you're so special. However, there was nothing behind the announcement. What they announced, it wasn't clear, well, how is that different than what I could use for OpenAI with another vendor? There was a little bit of it being embedded and pre-integrated. But then right after the conference, AI announces their OpenAI study mode. So they have this message where it's direct to consumer for learning applications, yet they're also this big partner. So the OpenAI may have made a few headlines, but at the conference, it wasn't as big of a deal other than catching people off guard. So it was a surprise, a sort of wow, but it wasn't at all central to the strategy, in my opinion. And as a matter of fact, I talked to a lot of people who've been involved in the testing of the AI leading up to the conference, and none of them even knew about the OpenAI announcement or knew how it fit in. So I don't want to 100% discount that, but I don't think that's the big part of their AI announcement. It just made for nice press releases and connections. The bigger change was on Ignite and how their whole strategy is built around using MCP, so basically a integration layer between LLM, large language models, and the application. And instead of just letting other people do that, Instructure is coming out saying, we're writing the MCP because we want to control access to all of our API and touch points and give a holistic AI solution. So on a practical term, what they're aiming to get to is take the rubric creation tool. They're saying, well, you shouldn't have to be in the rubric creation area to know to now hit a button and get it. You should just be able to ask the chat anywhere in the system and say, go create this. I don't need to understand where to go in the LMS. Just go do this for me. And there will be the architecture to allow that chat to make the routing decisions and then go do it. So the bet they're making is that's going to make things a lot better in the future, and particularly instructors and course designers to not have to know their way around the LMS. That's what they're betting on. That was completely missing in previous years, if you will. That was the fundamental difference, I think, that I saw.
Yeah, I think I found that all of that so fascinating and interesting to think about, because there's that sense in which it's a significant difference from some of the others, and they talked about how the others had kind of, really developed these kind of point-based solutions. But it made me think about user behavior, and to think, I think we've already mentioned a few things that are less glamorous things that have got people excited, and I feel slightly torn about what I think might happen in terms of user behavior. And there's part of me that thinks, oh, well, that's not how people engage with an LMS. Will it be successful? But then, when you're an instructor managing a lot of courses and you're having to navigate your way across, like there's a kind of strong argument around, a method like that being much more efficient for you to kind of do it if it works. But I also I had a webinar came across my eyes today around IgniteAI, and maybe this is a bit unkind because it's kind of early days, but the things that it was talking about IgniteAI being able to do felt like AI product developments that they kind of announced in the past. So I know it's a more holistic change to the way that you engage with an LMS, but I felt like the danger is it's a little bit light on what you can actually do with it. I don't know if that's fair.
Well, no, it's definitely fair. So I mentioned the big bet they're making, and I've said some of this in online conversations, particularly in LinkedIn. Yes, I'm becoming one of those people who uses LinkedIn more. But in any case, it's the message I just described was not clear from the main stage. It took me a lot of digging in private interviews to actually figure out what their strategy was. The main stage, they just mentioned AI, but nothing with any delivery dates or any clarity. And it took me pushing back and talking to executives to finally figure out what I described to you. Now, once I did that, I went and looked at some of their press releases and a couple of media interviews, and I would see parts of that argument there. So I guess that wasn't the message from the stage. It took a lot of digging to get there. But the second thing is I use the word bet because even if they were fully delivering what they talked about, and that's something I want to cover because it's not at all clear that they are, even if that's true, it gets to your point. Is the market ready for that? Is that what user behavior is actually going to support? It sounds nice in white paper from a strategy perspective, but it's a bet. It's not at all clear that that's the way people are going to go. So if they're right and if they deliver, they're going to leapfrog Blackboard even. But they have to first deliver and then determine if what you're raising is actually going to change, is actually what people want to do. Do they want to use a chat type of interface to access so much of the LMS capabilities? That's a very long-winded way to say your question is very fair, and I think it's one of the biggest questions moving forward, assuming that they can deliver on any of it in the first place.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about the agentic kind of approach as well, because I think when I was certainly looking at Blackboard and Brightspace, they're really strong in emphasizing, they don't necessarily use this phrase, but the human in the loop. And I think the more you go down the agentic route, the more it's not necessarily not a human in the loop, but that kind of whole approach is predicated on AI having a bit more agency to do the things that you're asking it to do. And so I think that's another element of the way I think about it is because of the maybe that lack of sense of clarity from Instructure in the past in terms of what their strategy is, I feel a little bit I don't have like loads of confidence. I like that they've made this bet, I think, and it is a really distinguishing feature from the others, but I don't have strong confidence based on their track record about where this is going to go. But I think it's also interesting, not just in terms of user behavior, but in terms of the way this pushes things beyond what feels like a very safe approach of not wanting to push instructors out of their comfort zone with AI features a little bit as well as that kind of dimension of it, which is super interesting.
Well, maybe that partially explains the lack of messaging of what their true strategy is. Trust me, I would be willing to bet that they mentioned human in the loop at least as much as D2L and Blackboard. That messaging was everywhere ad nauseum.
It's a security blanket.
Yes, it was everywhere. And so possibly, you're raising the point, agentic is not necessarily the same as human in the loop. And so maybe they didn't want to push it too far because of the comfort zone. But that is the bet they're making. So that's what we need to track moving forward. The bigger issue for me is the fact of, do you believe any of it? Because I certainly believe they're investing in re-architecting the platform and making a lot of engineering changes. But everything they showed on stage it wasn't even coming soon. It's like, in the future, you will be able to do this. And it wasn't clear, are you talking, it's already there, it's going to be there in the early fall, it's going to be there in 2026. None of that was clear or even mentioned during the show. And if you talk to the people who did some of the testing of these things, the early adopter testing, I think they still have a lot of work to define the product properly moving forward. So step one is actually delivering.
Yeah.
And then you're talking about steps 2 and 3 and 4.
I think that ties in for me a little bit with the OpenAI side of things, is that there's these, I think the Ignite thing is really super interesting and eye-catching for me, as is the OpenAI thing. But it's the substance and the kind of concreteness of what we're actually talking about that kind of raises question marks in my head. But anyway, like to the question I asked earlier around D2L, were there any other aspects of the kind of product suite? Obviously Instructure have a kind of wide product suite. Was there anything on continuing education?
Yeah, great segue. Canvas Career was actually one of the best received messages and the most interesting to me. So essentially they've taken the Canvas backend and they've sort of created a new continuing ed product on top of it. Where on the front end, they're streamlining it. They're making it much more AI and mobile first type of design. And they don't have the same constraints on what we talked about in structure or design for general higher education. And they developed a nice little package And they even were able to say this is being used now, but it'll be fully released at the end of the year. So actual dates. And I just thought that was quite interesting. So let me emphasize that they had the strongest moves in continuing education of the three vendors. I was not expecting to feel that way because we've talked in the past how they're not doing much with catalog and where is this going. Canvas career was broader and quite interesting. Initially, it's more on the academy side. So they had one of the Olympic teams that they need to train all of the employees and keep track of it. So it's sort of corporate training and feel, but it's for a captive audience. It's sort of like a corporate academy, training academy. I asked them, however, well, are you going to broaden this out and accept e-commerce and more of a B2C type of approach and get into micro-credential support and making it easier to do that type of continuing education? The verbal answer is yes, and that's what I'm interested in seeing. So that one, well beyond AI, and I thought that was the most interesting news that I saw.
To what extent is Parchment wrapped up in that, or was it a part of that?
Maybe if they're funding it, that's about it. There was no message of Parchment. Like Anthology, they're coming out with, they call it their ecosystem. The three pillars are Canvas, the LMS, Mastery Connect, the assessment engine, more K-12, and Parchment. So on the logos and what they talk about, like here's the broad company in our ecosystem, they would say that. Then nothing beyond that. Beyond that, Parchment was purely standalone. There were no real discussions of how Parchment plays into Canvas career. Parchment plays into the way Canvas is going. It just wasn't talked about. And it feels like somewhat a holding company. They've got a successful company. They own it. Things are going smoothly. It's making money. But it's really not, from a product perspective, part of the ecosystem. It's just listed there as an important part of them. Now, maybe that'll change, but so far it did not play into what you just asked about.
Because last year, at times, it seems they were trying to figure out a way to make that sort of part of that journey, transitioning from one thing to the other. But it seems like they haven't followed through with that.
Yeah, the two things I did not hear this year that I think we heard last year that you had talked about and that I went through Vegas on the way home is how Parchment fits into the ecosystem, actually changes the other products, and Conmigo. Both of those things were mentioned in the past, but like Conmigo just wasn't really spoken of much other than one or two panel sessions out there. So I'm not saying that's the wrong strategy, but they weren't publicly trying to figure out how it changes that life cycle. It seemed like they even backed off trying to do that messaging.
I feel like this conversation makes me think that we should develop some very niche bingo cards for these different vendors and their conferences and what they.
Well, I have a conference bingo card I'm going to unwrap soon, but.
Yeah. I think...
By the way, I can't remember if you have that in there or not, Morgan, but it better have something about AI's not replacing humans. So, because that'll be one of the most popular squares.
And it's like a calculator.
Yeah. 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 So that was the broader perspective. So and the other one, the underlying tone of KKR is a different owner than Thoma Bravo, both private equity, but there's a lot more of an investment for the future perspective happening this year than what I'd seen in previous years. Active, I feel like there's a lot of pressure from KKR, but it feels a lot more like you guys better figure out a way to grow, and we're going to find out in 3 to 5 years if that's succeeding. Under Thoma Bravo, it felt much more like you need to become profitable and we need to acquire companies in the next 12 months. So the KKR is an owner. It sounds weird for anybody who grew up in the 80s and thinking about KKR with Philip Morris and whatnot. That's much more of an investment focused ownership for them. So that was an underlying tone of we're not taking things for granted. We're investing. But, there's a lot of questions about are they actually delivering the products that people want?
And what were your reflections coming away from the conference based on conversations you had, just general vibes, if I can put it in that way, of their standing and future?
Well, the analogy that I used in my post.
I'm talking about pre-whiskey as well.
Oh yeah,
before that kind of kicked in.
Another thing,
yeah.
But it wasn't just whiskey. They had some of the best brisket I've had outside of Texas anywhere.
I'm calling for literal and metaphorical sober judgment.
Okay. Well, let me take a step back. If I were Morgan, I'd be whipping out the disjuncture word. There's a big disconnect between engineering, investment, big AI visions and stuff like that, and what's actually happening on the ground. And there's just a big disjuncture between them that I think is a growing challenge there. Now, to the degree that they make things work, wow, big bet they might leapfrog. They're already the leaders, but they might become the leaders in multiple areas and really accelerate moving forward. However, if they don't deliver, and I'm not seeing evidence of them delivering, it's more of the Apple intelligence type of situation where they're losing credibility by talking about things but not delivering. And that when they deliver things, it's not hitting the mark to where people actually use it and what they're really looking for. So disjuncture is the big takeaway, even though they have all of that investment and all of that strategy. So that makes it interesting for us. I've mentioned the two bets: Anthology getting through the debt restructuring, and Instructure if they can deliver on the bet and if the bet's going to pay off in terms of user behavior. It's going to be really interesting to watch. But it was not clear at the conference of, wow, these guys have it together, and yeah, this is what we're going to be seeing.
I feel like AI has really energized a lot of the product developments and the differentiation of the companies. But I think this kind of maybe ties in with some of the stuff we said about the things that people get excited about relative to those things. I mean, what are your reflections coming out of these conferences on the kind of the impact of these things on things like implementations and actual decisions around that? Because and other areas where the rubber really hits the road. Because I think it's interesting for us to talk about the differentiation through AI strategies and the way the product's developing and the bets that people are making, but the extent to which that turns the dial on, implementations and market share, I think it's just interesting.
I think that sometimes in the past, and I'm probably the most at fault, have emphasized too much on new implementations and LMS switches. And a lot of the news has been Anthology using AI to slow down defections. And I'm seeing even more of it. And I'm talking to customers who are basically saying, hey, we're buying into this story. We're seeing the benefits. We're not switching. So to a degree, I think it's still very important, but a lot of times it comes across to who's not leaving and making changes.
Yep.
My personal view, AI it's not like the early MOOC phase of a lot of noise, but it really isn't directly impacting things. I think it is directly impacting things. I think we've got to figure it out. It's close to the level of internet in terms of rethinking educational technology. But so far, it's not changing LMS switches per se. But I think it's having a material impact on their product strategies and what customers are actually seeing and using. So I guess I'm bullish on the broad impact of AI, but not necessarily that we're going to start seeing a lot of product switches in the near term.
Yeah. What about you, Morgan?
I have a weird answer to that. I think we're on the precipice, and I hesitate to say this because so often people have said similar things and they've been wrong, but I think we're on the precipice of a fundamental change in how we think about the LMS, and I think AI is going to drive that. And we kind of also need to do it because of the cost pressures, because the cost is just not sustainable. And, one of the leadership of one of the companies said to me, it's so frustrating. People are prepared to pay $20 a month for OpenAI for a license, but they balk at paying $15 for the LMS, which they use for.
That's $20 a month versus $15 a year.
Yes, that was his point. Yeah, and it's frustrating, and especially as people are wanting these changes, and the products have changed dramatically over the last 25 years or 30 years. So I think we're at that point where things are going to really shift. It's going to be interesting comparing the shift in higher ed with the shift in K-12, because I see the sort of rise there of Google particularly being an interesting development, but it's going to be a different shift, I think.
Yeah, and I think
and this might get to, by the way, on the precipice point, and this is a teaser. It's going to be coming out fairly soon, but Morgan knows we're working with a guest author who's putting out a post that we're going to be publishing, essentially saying the LMS market is 30 years old. It's, if you view it as starting with the IMS group defining LMS stuff, which quickly led to Blackboard, to WebCT, to, these other web-based LMSs. So we're at the 30-year mark, but the products haven't changed. But then Morgan's argument, which I agree with, is we're on the precipice of a big change that we really haven't seen. It's certainly in the first 30 years of the market. So I agree with that usage of precipice.
And I've been trying to think of an analogy. A few years ago, Michael Feldstein wrote about canvases entering their awkward teenage years, and I've been trying to think of the LMSs entering its 30s. It's having an identity crisis.
Yeah.
Or something like that, but in a good way. But I can't think of one for the moment.
Yeah. What's your view, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, I agree in that AI is going to fundamentally change some of the features that we've kind of become established in the LMS side of things. I think the thing that I'm always interested in, and the tension in my head, is always that juxtaposition between technology moving forward and products being developed and actually what's happening on the ground, and the extent to which higher education can sometimes be sort of sealed off from what's happening. And I think that doesn't necessarily change some of the things that I've said, but I think it always makes me reflect in terms of the impact of some of these things and where companies invest. I think it's just going to be super interesting to see in the next 5 years. I think we'll have got to a stage where there'll be maybe a consolidation of tools and approaches that maybe we'll have a bit of a clearer picture on the ways in which AI has changed and is going to is changing the LMS product and what's going to fall by the wayside. I mean, I think another element of it is, and I know we're going to get onto this talk in the future, is the extent to which other technologies and vendors and AI companies are going to influence things. So I think it has all the kind of components of a really interesting time in general terms, because you've got the kind of AI stuff playing out, it's still not being figured out. You've got companies making bets. I think the Instructure bet is super interesting. You've got all the uncertainty around Blackboard, and that doesn't just relate to their product, but it also relates to the wider market and the impacts it might have on, you mentioned around Instructure, and I know other companies have mentioned to me, in the past few years, a lot about Anthology and Blackboard's financial health. So I know that's kind of on their agenda. So I think it's, for a market that can sometimes be a bit static. I think it's a super interesting time. Lots of stuff to work out, lots of bets to see how they go. One big question mark over a company that actually could impact the rest of the market quite significantly. So yeah, watch the space.
Yeah, so it's an exciting market, but maybe not in market share perspective, at least in the short term. But I do think it's exciting, a lot of changes. We'll have to hear from Morgan from Edinburgh, from Moodle Global, what you hear there. But yeah, no, this has been a great conversation. I really think there's going to be a lot of coverage we'll need to do this fall, particularly on these big bets and exploring that user behavior topic that you're bringing up. Is that, what's really going to change on user behavior? And does it change whose behavior is going to drive the future of the market as well? That's part of the argument I think I'll probably make. But it's been great seeing you guys. So we're going to be closing out season 2 soon for the podcast and restarting it in the fall. But I thank all of our listeners and viewers.